I'd like to call to order the February 24th Joint Policy and Planning Commission with the Environmental Board, and we are calling it at 6:31 tonight. Due to the virtual format of tonight's meeting, I'd like to start by providing some guidelines. We have participants attending by computer and others who are attending by phone. For all meeting attendees who wish to speak, please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. Mute your microphone when not speaking, and if having technical issues, try joining the meeting using a different device such as a smartphone or tablet, or use the call-in information in the meeting invite to call into the meeting. And for tonight, Kristen, will you please call roll for PPC, and then Lucy, you can call roll for the Environmental Board.
Yes, Commissioner Lewis.
Here.
Commissioner Monahan.
Here.
Vice Chair Voice.
Here.
Commissioner Milligan.
Here.
Commissioner Bader.
Here.
Commissioner Zaragoza.
Here.
And Chair Fall.
Here.
All 7 members are present.
I don't think it's actually me. I'm not the liaison for the Environmental Board. I think it would be Stacy. She just may need a minute to pull up the roster.
Yep, I have it ready. Thanks. Danny Maiden. Don McWilliams.
Here.
Rishi Hazra.
Here.
Cameron Fisher. Laura Labeco. Chair Nancy Davidson.
Here.
We have an excused absent from Dan. Ann Newcomb.
Here.
Jamie Finch.
Here.
Tom Anderson.
Here.
Surya Bola Bragada. And Janet Wall.
Okay, and thank you, Stacy. So for tonight's structure, for tonight's meeting public hearing format, we will have 2 Title 18 presentations by Lucy Sloman. And it'll be on public hearing of the draft code for outdoor lighting and for Shoreline Master Program. After each topic, there will be an opportunity for commissioners to ask questions, followed by a public comment based on the topic. And then tonight's commissioners' discussions will be different from the past, and PPC will not be participating in the actual discussions, and Nancy Davidson will be chairing the discussions for the Environmental Board. During this time, PPC needs to turn off their cameras, and we will be joining back in when the next topic comes up. Okay, with that.
Ron, Chair Fall, would you like to open it up for just general public comments first?
Yes.
Not regarding the topics.
Just about to do that, so thank you. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up with general public comment. This is not related to the public hearing tonight. Kristen, are there any members of the public who would like to speak on general topics?
No, no one is raising their hand. I'll give it 1 more second. Or 3 more seconds. No, there's no one who would like to speak.
Okay, very good. So we'll go ahead and close it out. And then we will go ahead and continue with the presentation. So Lucy, you have the floor.
Good evening. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So tonight we're here to with our first discussion drafts on outdoor lighting and the Shoreline Master Program. So I'm just going to run through the schedule just so you have a sense of kind of where we are in the process. Last summer, we met with you all on a gap analysis and update method for Bucket 1. In late January this year, early this year, we issued discussion drafts, and then we held an open house for the public on February 9th. And then here we are at the public hearing with a deliberation and recommendation to staff. Once we get through that, then we will move into this more general schedule of preparing a final consolidated draft for Title 18 and a consolidated draft public hearing in August and September of this year, and then it will move on to council review and deliberation. So first, we're going to talk about outdoor lighting. Outdoor lighting is consolidating 3 existing codes. There's a general outdoor lighting section in 1807, which was adopted in 2004. Central Issaquah has a lighting section that was adopted, or lighting chapter that was adopted in 2013. And then in 2018, that became the lighting for Issaquah Highlands and Tallis. And then in 2001, Old Town adopted their design standards, which included site lighting in CBD zone only. What we've done, the basis for the code that you're looking at is the Model Lighting Ordinance, which was developed in partnership between the International Dark Skies Association and the Illuminating Engineering Society of North America, which rolls off your tongue. And then we've tailored it for the city. So here's a bit of an overview. First of all, we are lowering some of the thresholds when things need to come into compliance. It's quite high right now, and that makes it harder to implement. We are asking for a broader level of compliance. Single-family homes are included, for instance, in the proposal, but you don't always have to get permits. I'll talk a little more about this in a minute. We're using lighting zones. There are currently lighting zones in the general IMC chapter on lighting, but they're based on the comp plan. And in this case, it's tied to the intensity of the use based on land use zoning, and that sets lighting levels and fixture types. For non-residential and multifamily properties, they have to get permits. Small and simple projects have fixed lighting levels, which we call the prescriptive approach. And complex projects are calculated based on the use and the IESNA's levels. Residential projects with less than 7 units and no common area have to comply, but no permit is required unless some other permit is triggered. So, for instance, if you were doing a new home, we would ask you to show the lighting as part of your building permit. And then a new aspect of this is dark sky hours when lighting is either reduced or turned off. We've also kind of fine-tuned accent lighting. It is for flags, art, building and landscape below 15 feet, and contained up lighting. And by contained up lighting, it's kind of what's shown in the upper right image, where there is a roof or some element that would capture the light. Along I-90, accent lighting is only allowed for, and when I say flags, it's actually U.S. federal flags. It's not all flags. And then building and landscape lighting below 15 feet. There were 3 considerations that were in the memo that on outdoor lighting, and we can come back and talk about these. One was the threshold between the residential that doesn't need a permit and the non-residential and multifamily. The second had to do with the criteria that distinguish between small and simple versus complex projects. And the third was the dark sky hours. We've had a number of meetings since then. We had our open house, as I mentioned. We've had one-on-one meetings with any of the commissioners or board members who wanted or were able to meet with us. I've also met with Police Chief Schwan. And so some of the things that we heard in those were concerned that landscape lighting is not allowed in single-family zones, questions about how construction and security lighting would be handled, confirming or concerned that right-of-way lighting shows up in there and that it will be moved into the circulation section. Reconciling holiday lighting versus the prohibition on building outlining. Compliance with dark skies, how can we do it sooner or make it an incentive? Should the lighting that's exempt have to comply with dark sky hours? And when I talked to Police Chief Schwan, she was not concerned about the specific provisions that I talked to her about, but she did have some questions about enforcement and how that would work, especially for dark sky hours. And I just want you to know, as part of our conversation, that the images that were part of the memo that are resources about, how we get a sense of what lumens are, what the color temperatures mean, and what the lighting zone means. I've got this slide here for our reference if those topics come up. And now we're ready for discussion and comment.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy. And so, commissioners who have questions, please please notify me by putting do you want to go ahead and make a comment in the chat window? Give it a couple seconds here for people to question in. And our first question is from Joy Lewis. So Joy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Good evening, Commissioner Joy Lewis. Lucy, I'm hoping you can speak a little bit more about the multifamily residential with 6 and fewer units being exempt from the permitting. I want to clarify that, from the permitting. And I want to talk a little bit about the consideration that we had discussed about why staff settled on that number of units. And if you could kind of talk a little bit more about that, specifically in reference to the fact that we are hoping to and anticipating of attracting more of that missing middle of housing, which tends to fall around 3 units when we're building kind of smaller, more dense townhomes, for instance. And so why maybe, for instance, 4 and up wasn't considered?
Well, I wouldn't say it wasn't considered. What I would say is the model lighting ordinance has set that breaking point that we've used of the 7 dwelling units. But I will also emphasize that one of the components that they included was no common spaces. And the common space is relatively broad. A parking lot would be considered a common space. An entry court or common area would be considered an open space. I think that I had the same reaction, maybe we should lower this. And then in further discussion, we were concerned with exactly what you brought up, the missing middle, that we want to avoid additional costs and burdens. There's still compliance, as you mentioned, but there isn't the requirement for some of the additional permitting. So that was how we said it.
Thank you. My other question is a little bit about compliance, specifically for existing lighting. We had a lot of specific language that we saw about specifically at what threshold you need to be able to then upgrade your lighting. And really the goal, I think that we all have, is to be able to have all lighting fit within the lighting code. And so I wanted to give you the chance to kind of speak a little bit more about what that plan is for compliance and how we can kind of be able to help convert existing lighting to be more in line with this lighting code.
Right. And this, frankly, is one of the challenges. There are a couple of different methodologies that were proposed within the model lighting ordinance. One of them is to set an amortization date by which all lighting in the city has to come into compliance. And while that's kind of appealing, it would require that we have the bandwidth to create an inventory of everything in the city to know whether someone has changed out their lighting or not. And that seemed beyond what we could do. So what we used was, again, from the model lighting ordinance, and basically they use a 25% threshold. So if you're adding 25% more parking, 25% more units, 25% more seating. You've got the code in front of you, but they had several examples. And then also, if you're changing 25% of the lighting in a parking lot or your exterior lighting. And right now, the threshold in 1807 is quite high. It's 75% of the value. And it's hard to know what that means, whether that's of the lighting or the overall improvements. It may very well be the improvements because we can see that easily on the King County side, as we've discussed. But that's a pretty high threshold at which you're supposed to bring things into compliance. And so that's why we proceeded with the proposal from the model lighting ordinance.
Thank you so much, Lucy.
Thank you, Commissioner Lewis. And Commissioner Milligan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. This is Commissioner Nina Milligan, and thank you for your presentation, Lucy. I just have a question about the public comments that you shared on the screen and summarized for us. And I'm not clear when these came in and if these have already impacted the material that's in our packet or if that is yet to be responded to. Thank you.
That's a great clarification. So we have been logging all the comments that we've gotten through the PPC meetings and public comment prior to the discussion draft being issued. The ones that I was showing are the ones that have come in after the discussion draft was issued. So these have not been incorporated. We've gotten a couple of emails from the public, and then we had the open house. We've had one-on-one with some of the commission and board members, and then the discussion with the police chief. So as we've been hearing this, it does not represent every comment we've gotten. So if you didn't see your comment there, please don't think that we're ignoring it. But these were sort of the top comments that we thought would be helpful as part of this discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner Milligan. And Commissioner Finch, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Jamie Finch speaking. I had a question just to make sure that I was on, in terms of scope of what is being discussed. So dark hours, I think, am I correct that the goal is for that to apply existing and new at some point, and that the discussion is around how to do that? Is that accurate?
Right. So any new lighting that's installed would have to comply with all of it. And as things are replaced, they would comply. I think one of the questions that we've gotten is, how can we encourage that to happen sooner? And I think one of the things that Director Dhaliwal and I have recognized is that there's going to be, with all of Title 18, but particularly with outdoor lighting, an education component. And, I think we're hoping to encourage people to do it. Not only does it save them money, but it also, in talking with the police chief, improves some of the security options. So I think we're hoping that through that kind of education, we may get people to do it sooner.
Okay, but there's no actual mechanism proposed that would force anyone to do it. It's all would be voluntary unless you had to meet the threshold or have an entirely new project.
Yes.
And that's the same across all the other ones. Okay. Or across all the different aspects. One of the other questions I had was, is it standard for dark hours to be a relative target? Like I think it was a 30% reduction versus a fixed threshold of, well, I don't know what the threshold would be, but it seems weird to define something as a relative to what the full brightness would be versus a threshold. That's an
interesting question. Again, model lighting ordinance proposed a 30% reduction. I have looked at a couple of, I've looked at more than a couple, but I've looked at maybe 6 to 8 lighting codes of our peer and neighboring cities. Only 2 of them have the dark sky hours. I think one has you turn it off completely, and the other had it again by percentage, but it varied by land use. So some land uses were 30%, some land uses were 50%. The one thing that I did pick up from that community was that all light fixtures had to be turned down by that percentage, rather than selectively turning down some of the fixtures, maybe more, so that your average was 30%. Because I think we want the overall lighting to go down, not just mathematically the number goes down.
Okay, thank you, Lucy.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you, Commissioner Finch. Commissioner Voice, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fowl. And Lucy, one question real quickly. I'm pretty sure it's a spelling mistake on page 25 of the packet. EC, I believe it says, if indirect lighting is desired, the light may be beamed upward and then reflected one from the underside of the canopy. It's spelled W-O-N as a victory.
There's a dyslexic brain for the win. Okay, so
For the win.
For the win. For the one. I will. This is something that came up. I am sure there's some other typos. I know that I noticed something that was plural and should have been singular. One of the things that we will do as we're preparing the consolidated draft is that we have someone on staff who loves to edit, and she goes and makes it all bright and shiny and sparkly, and gets all the punctuation consistent with the style guide. So thank you for pointing that out, and I'm sure that there's a treasure hunt of other errors to be found.
Okay, that really wasn't my question. Just I figured that was a typo. Because I'd like to provide a visual for everybody that's tuning in right now. So my understanding of the building outlines, I'm thinking of the Vale Apartments. I'm thinking of Issaquah Commons, Safeway, Bed Bath & Beyond with the rope lighting over the crosswalk. Would all of those be non-compliant? Because there's no shields above them?
So strings of lights are not non-compliant. Building, so that one of the public comments that was pointed out was we allow holiday lighting, and we said don't outline buildings. So we definitely need to reconcile those two, because outlining buildings as part of a holiday lighting program is not uncommon. So that's one of the things that I think was a really good catch. I will say that currently we do not allow building outlining. Old Town had that as a prohibition. That was pulled into the sign code when we updated it last year, and that you couldn't outline buildings. So I think that that doesn't mean it can't be changed as part of this process, but that's why it was pulled in here, because it was consistent with our previous discussions around the sign code and Old Town.
Okay. Yeah, I just, again, I mean, if you look at, I personally think it beautifies the city, but again, Front Street is another example, the Village Theater, all of those places appear to have lighting, building outlining. So again, I just making that clear to everybody who's paying attention.
I appreciate that.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Voice. And Commissioner Wall, you have the floor.
Yes, this is Janet Wall, and I wanted to comment about there have been studies that outdoor lighting can increase predation on salmon fry. Was this taken into account in the lighting regulations?
So, Board Member Wall, we do have some restrictions on dock lighting that is included in the Shoreline Master Program, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we have proposed within the general lighting to set color lighting so that on private property, it's 3000 K, which is a warmer light, and I think is better, is consistent with the direction that's come out of King County and WIRA 8 in terms of reducing impacts on fish. Street lighting remains at 4000 K. There's not as much consistency in terms of safety with the 3000 K, and the city had already made a change to 4000 K. And so we didn't propose any adjustment for that color. Does that help?
Yes, somewhat. Just wondered whether, yeah, you did take into account the location of the streams.
Oh, that's a very good point. So the outdoor lighting previous, as it's currently regulated now, and we carried this forward that critical areas lighting at its edge is limited to 0.3 foot candles, which is a very low level. And the purpose of that is to try with streams, wetlands, et cetera, to limit the amount of artificial light that is going into those areas, in addition to any color adjustments.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner Wall. And Commissioner Chair Davidson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ron. This is Nancy Davidson from the Environmental Board. Lucy, my question for you is, how did you take into account security issues, particularly given the significant increase in theft and at homes, in businesses, in apartment buildings? How will this lighting ordinance affect those and the cameras that people are trying to do to protect their investments?
I saw that question. I think we're going to have to do more research on the camera question. I don't know technically about that aspect of it. In terms of security, there is the ability to have security lighting that comes on when motion is detected. And the reduction in lighting for the dark sky hours was actually endorsed by the police chief, and we've heard that from others, that it's advantageous because the lights pop up when the motion takes place, and it both notifies neighbors and law enforcement that there's activities in areas where you might not expect it. So I guess that's where the code is at this time.
I have a second question for you, Lucy. So as we look at this lighting ordinance, it would apply to the city and the school district as well as the residents and commercial areas. So this is going to apply across all sectors, correct?
Correct.
So there's no exemptions for city or school district, right?
Dark sky hours will have, for public properties, has a different, it is not given the same across the board dark sky hour. And in talking with other departments, there is, I think there were a couple of reasons. One, we want to make the most of public investments. And two, there is a more direct feedback loop. With private property, we have to have something in code that establishes when those dark sky hours would be. With public projects, we are able to that we don't get into long, sorry, I'm getting messages, that we don't, that we can get a feedback from the public that helps us adjust things if it's not working. Sorry.
And I just have one last question, since we're not environmental board doesn't really look at projects specifically, but this is a project. So if this was adopted this year, let's just say it will not affect the new high school, correct? Because the new high school is already being approved, correct?
Correct.
Okay, just checking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Davidson. Okay, the next question I have is for Sarah Bader. And before you go, Sarah, just a quick reminder, please keep the comments or the questions more of clarifying questions than deliberation. And Sarah, you have the floor.
Great, thanks, Chair. This is Sarah Bader. I have a question that is similar to Chair Davidson's first question about safety and how the code kind of allows for safety. And the example I'll give is that kind of security camera that's been installed in the Target parking lot that has like a blue flashing light on the top of it. And I'm assuming, I don't know if it's because it's a temporary structure, if it doesn't apply or what, but I know that there's language in the code that kind of says that lighting shouldn't be like easily confused with, police lights or fire lights or kind of public officer lights. And the first time I drove past that camera, I thought that that's what it was, and didn't realize until like a couple of visits later that it was like a security camera. And I'm assuming that, that camera is there for a reason, to deter, a lot of the theft that's been happening in that Target parking lot. But I'm wondering just kind of how the code allows for those kind of like niche security issues that might not necessarily comply with how it's written.
So remember, this is our first discussion draft. So we're getting a lot of great things to follow up on. And I think those security lights with the blue that I've heard that were included in a comment today will require more research. In general, where you have doors, entrances, certain kinds of loading docks, certain areas that may need lighting and off hours, the code sets up allows for motion activated lighting that will stay on for 5 minutes following the end of activity. So that's the way it's written now.
Okay, thank you very much, Commissioner Bader. And I also have a question. I think I'm the last person here to have a question. At least that has already posted in the chat. So if you still have questions, please post it in the chat. Going back to, I have two questions actually. Going back to kind of what Janet Wall had asked about in terms of the Kelvin, because I was thinking of asking something similar. How does Kelvin of lighting affect birds and fish and other wildlife? And is there a difference between fish, or how Kelvin affects fish and birds? And so do we need to have code that specifies certain kelvins for locations, like maybe a certain Kelvin that's over water versus a different Kelvin that might be for businesses inland? And then my next question is, what's more important, Kelvin or lumens to protect wildlife?
Okay, I'm not an expert, but I'll give it a try. Some of the studies have focused on humans and animals have focused on circadian rhythms and said that 3000 K has less impact. When King County issued their guidance for dock lighting, it was to be below 3000 K. So I'm just going to go back up here and point out, so this is 3000 K, and for the dock lighting, which we'll talk about in a minute, we propose 2700 K. So 3000 K is warm, 2700 K is quite amber. So that's why we were not proposing anything below 3000 on sites, and 3000 K feels pretty sunny and warm. 4000 K, there have been mixtures of studies. about whether that somewhat bluer light, bluer light is better for clarity and therefore better for preventing accidents. I think that's why the city, when they began switching in 2018 to convert their street lights to LEDs, went with 4,000. So but it's still kind of early days in some ways with lighting, but that's, I think, where the science is right now, that in terms of animals, including humans, you want to be 3,000 K, but there may be some benefit to visual rendition at 4,000 K. And in terms of lighting levels versus lighting color, I don't know enough to answer that question. I assume it's both, but I don't know that.
Okay, thank you. And I am not seeing any additional questions, so we will go ahead and close this out and open it up for public comment on this topic.
Chair Fall, if I may just try and answer your question too, I think I'll give it a shot too. In terms of the impact, I think is if there's bright light, say for instance on a bridge, that shines directly onto the fish, and that blinds them, so they become more of a, the predators can get to them a little bit more. So that's sort of the link, I believe, what you were getting at in terms of distinguishing the light for critical areas versus the, if there's a lower lighting level where it's directly shining on to say a stream or something like that. So yes, those studies have shown that lighting levels play a big role in terms of how the fish counts and things of that nature.
Okay, thanks. It sounds like you are looking into it then.
Correct.
Right. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up for public comment. Kristen, are there any members of the public that would like to speak tonight on this topic?
Yes, Christy Triple has signed up to speak. Christy, I am making you a panelist, and you should be unmuted and able to turn on your camera if you would like right now.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Christy Triple, and tonight I'm speaking on behalf of Raleigh Properties and Businesses in our neighborhood regarding the draft lighting code. My address is 1595 Northwest Gilman Boulevard, Suite 1 here in Issaquah. I sent along written comments earlier, but wanted to take a moment to speak in person more generally regarding lighting. I'll caveat our input from Raleigh Properties with this is one of those topics that's complex, challenging, and ever so important on many facets. It's probably right up there with the topic of signage. So when it comes to lighting as a community, it's important that we balance public safety and aesthetics with our environment. Absolutely important. So with that lens comes our comment. Lights serve an important psychological as well as economic function, especially during our dark Northwest winters. It provides an opportunity for beautification and aids in geographic orientation as well. And better lighting makes safer spaces and creates spaces for interaction. And wayfinding, whether it be car, bike, or movement, is imperative as well. Signage, visibility, and lighting play into that. I did want to note that I thought the design guidelines were really well written as part of the code. And then just wanted to share a little bit more about when it comes to buildings, not allowing accent lighting higher than 15 feet really does deprive some of the whimsy and delight that could make buildings art. As Lisa Picard, who served on the city's Central Issaquah Plan Task Force way back, like 2007, 2008, she said, a building is one of the largest art forms a person interacts with. It influences if people want to be there, how they feel when they are there, and when done right, can add an element of beauty and interest to the fabric of the built environment, which I think we're all hoping for as we see our community evolve and change. An example is Raleigh Properties 2005 popular office building with its internally lit stairs. Eliminating this type of lighting won't create a black canvas or a serene setting. Our hope is that the updated code will provide a more nuanced approach that allows buildings to have some soul in a tasteful way that inspires. And in an existing scenario, which was discussed earlier, if rooftop lighting or building outline were not allowed or time limited, I can't imagine Gilman Village not having their festive lighting along its roof lines. I feel like the collective of buildings would kind of feel sad and dark without them. And we all know lighting is a critical factor in crime deterrent and prevention, both in public and private spaces. In the 16 years I've worked here in this community, the Issaquah Police Department has always advocated for crime prevention through design. And I'm glad to hear that that will continue to be a consideration in the updated code, as our public needs to feel safe and for buildings and property to that end as well. So I was really glad to hear that Chief Schlon has been engaged. And finally, we just asked that the maintenance section of the code be reviewed further regarding the threshold and expectation of existing properties. And thank you for the opportunity to comment tonight.
Thank you, Christy. Connie Marsh would like to speak next, just for a moment. Connie, you're a panelist and should be unmuted, and you can turn on your camera.
All right, I'm now visible and everything. So Connie Marsh, I live up on Squawk. So the conversation is function of light versus light pollution. So we want light to function, but we don't want pollution. I can name my favorite polluted areas, and that would be all of Issaquah Highlands along the ridge, because it gleams at night in an unfortunate way. It's the car dealerships that are very bright because, of course, they want to be seen and at night, and things look good that way. And then I sort of go, well, I find places, and sporting field lighting that impacts the neighbors and shines into their windows, but that doesn't sound like it's going to be addressed much more than it already is. So I find municipal lighting in many places is not enough. So a lighting code to me would add appropriate lighting in cutoff areas. So it would go down for security, not up into the sky. So then as you walk around at a foot level, which is the scariest way to be going around when you have no light, you aren't in the puddles, you aren't tripping over the curbs. Okay, so we want that. As you walk down the street, what you don't want is you don't want those unfortunate lights shining out from inside of buildings and gleaming all over everything in all their fluorescent splendor. So in an individual building, I think you can have light pollution. And so I think you should require screening of like interior lights. Jackson Shell Station at the corner of Front and Sunset had that issue and still does, where it leaks out the side. And then the other area, which I wrote in about, is this construction lighting. And of course, we know Costco is like one big 9-story times 2 bundle of lighting leakage. And that needs to be addressed, or they could screen it, they can do something, but that is light pollution. The other issue with buffer edges is we allow a 15-foot setback at the edge of critical area buffers, but you can't put building in it. So what do people do? They put their asphalt right next to the critical area buffers, and usually it's parking. And so the first thing that happens is people turn in at night and their headlights are going on and on and on into the critical area buffer all the time, which is not measured. And that is in almost every critical area buffer in our town has that situation. So and then of course people want to light it because then they want to be able to walk from where they parked over to the building that they're going into. And so many of these buffers have way more light than the standard that Lucy was talking about. So I don't know who really measures, because I don't think that's true. So I'm looking at it a little, maybe more holistically on things that I would like to never see again. And like Regal Cinema, isn't that the cinema kiosk that I can see from very, very, very far afar? And can you screen it? Does it have to have lower lumens? I don't know. It should be fixed. Oh, but Christy, I agree with Christy's. Maybe our darkest months of the year are created for holiday lighting, and they can just go till February until it gets light, and then they have to come off. Thanks.
Thank you. There is no one else who has signed up to speak right now.
Okay, and thank you, Kristen. So I'm going to leave public comment open, and we're going to move on to commissioner discussions. And what we're going to do is Chair Davidson is going to go ahead and take over for chairing the environmental board, and PPC will please turn off your cameras, and we will turn them back on when Nancy is complete. And Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ron. So the purpose for the environmental board, just wanted to point out, now is our opportunity to provide comments to PPC that we have on the lighting portion of the code at this point. And so what I'm looking for is any feedback the environmental board has. And with that, we're really looking for comments. And does anybody have any comments for PPC on lighting? Any comments?
I have comments.
Well, I see that Tom, sorry, I missed you. I guess I didn't see you come in. So go ahead, Tom. Tom Anderson, please.
Thank you. Tom Anderson speaking. One question I have is about what sort of a measurement is going to be coupled with this. If we're going to make a big deal about lighting and lighting pollution in the air, well, we need to couple that with a program to monitor, well, where are we? Where are we in that regard? And are we making progress forward or backward? So I know that's not what the code is about. The code is about what people who live in the city have to do, but the city needs to provide a measurement to track progress on that, just as we've talked about for other things that we've worked on environmental board. And I'm wondering how we align with our sister cities in the area, King County. I know there was a little mention there about, well, some of the others do have some recent updates to lighting, and they're not all aligned. Well, this model lighting ordinance sounds wonderful. The dark sky organization and all is our municipalities taking this seriously? And is this like the new thing that everybody's going to align with, or where do we stand as a region on aligning with those sort of things, or is every municipality going off in a different direction? Let's see what else. I just wanted to agree with the statements before about how education of the public is an important part of such a program. The commercial areas are one thing, but if you really want to make some progress with the relatively unregulated single-family residence communities and all that, I think a lot of progress can be made. But the key is in education of people as to why we'd want to do this and what when you're designing your pathway lighting, etc., how to go about that. I like to vacation in Sun River, Oregon, which is really big on keeping the skies dark because there's a little observatory there, and so everybody can take it seriously because we all like to go to the observatory and see that star show at night. And by golly, you can tell the difference. You can tell those skies are dark. And so when we look at the down lighting that is required and characteristic of all the paths in Sun River, we remember, oh yeah, that's because we like to look at the stars, and it seems to work. So public education is a important part of making some progress in this area. Thank you. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Tom. Great comments. Now I'll turn it over to Don McWilliams. Don, please go ahead.
Hey, Nancy, Don McWilliams here. So I'll keep my comments focused on the environmental aspect. So as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on nocturnal animals, but as I understand it, bright lights that are shined into their eyes can blind them for short periods of time, making them open to predators, including fish. So I would just ask that the city do a little more research around critical areas, streams, riparian zones, on how this lighting code would affect those areas to try to protect the critters at night that are in there trying to survive.
Thank you, Don. I assume that's all of your comments, Don? Okay. Jamie Finch, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nancy. Jamie Finch speaking. One of my kind of high-level comments is that it would just be really helpful to understand, and this is kind of, I think we're probably past this part of the process, but in my mind, it's hard for me now because I don't know that we have a really specific problem statement of like, this is where our existing light pollution comes from. And so I do think that for us to really evaluate policies related to lighting, I do think, and I know it's not easy to do an inventory, or I'm not sure what the right approach to that would be, but I do think for us to really feel confident in the recommendations that we're making, that is a part of the process that if there is a way to incorporate, I'd really encourage, because I think it's really difficult now to not know what are the biggest contributors to know where we should be focusing. I think in the same vein, I'm also interested in the biggest gaps currently between the needs of public and other uses of lighting and the actual current levels. Like, where do we have the biggest deltas between the actual needs? And maybe it's to Connie's point, where are those big light centers that might be where are those light centers that are not the result of a public need? So I do think that piece I really would love to understand and see how that applies to this update. The last two comments that I have, one, I do wonder how we can connect the dark sky hours to the ICAP. I was just thinking before, is if it's unnecessary light at night, it's also unnecessary energy use at night. And so I do wonder how, as we think about incentivizing as well as public education, I do think that there's opportunities to position this in multiple ways, and I would encourage the city to get creative on how those two things might come together. And then the last piece, which is related to that, is how do we make sure that we're pushing to find ways to incentivize all of these different aspects for existing buildings? Because I think we all know that there's going to be, it's obviously great to have this going forward, but a lot of the impact is already being felt and will continue to be felt from existing structures. And so that it sounds like the city's already looking at that and considering that, but just would be something that I would encourage them to continue to pursue and evaluate. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Ann Newcomb, go ahead.
Thanks, everyone. And Newcomb here. I like what you're doing with the lighting. And I just want to add one more idea for educating people of why it's a good idea. And that is the bugs. I know I said it the other day, but I was really serious. Bugs, as everybody probably knows, have decreased drastically. And that can have a lot of replications, but they're food. They're food to a lot of species. So bugs are important, and one of the ways they get killed, when people think, is because of night lighting. So it's not just about stars, but the stars are important. The fish. I think about the bugs. Thanks. And a lot of people, I mean, if we advertise that, some people will be like, well, that's great. I could use less bugs. But maybe if we remind them that bugs are food for birds, they'll be more motivated. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. This is Nancy Davidson, and I did have a couple of comments. The first one is I would agree with Dawn in terms of trying to protect and reduce the amount of lighting that gets into our critical areas to reduce those impacts. And I think Connie had a good point in terms of where the parking lots lie and where the lights from our cars all go in. So it's something to think about potentially even as we look further into Title 18 and how we might want to screen those critical areas to protect those areas, put maybe fencing or something. The second thing I'd point out is that I think is missing from this code is indoor lighting. At nighttime, many of our gas stations and others are lit up inside quite brightly. I get the security concerns, but does have a lot of light that comes out and shines out from those buildings. And while we're focused on outdoor lighting, I think we also need to consider what's happening with our indoor lighting that's now reflecting outdoors. And I think that's a piece that's missing here. It may be addressed somewhere else in the code. I don't know, but I think we need to be thinking about, particularly at nighttime, how much light we want to come from the indoors and show up outdoors and how long that should go. I know it's different for different kinds of businesses, but I think it's a big gap in this outdoor lighting standard that should be considered. Are there any other comments from the Environmental Board? Lucy, I hope you got what you needed. I hope that the PPC did as well. And with this, I'm going to turn the meeting back over to Ron to move on to the next place. And thank you very much for the opportunity to provide our feedback.
Thank you, Chair Nancy, or Chair Davidson, sorry. So go ahead, PPC can turn your cameras back on. And Lucy, you can go ahead and continue on with topic number 2.
Great. Do you see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So second discussion draft we're reviewing tonight is the Shoreline Master Program, also called SMP, and I tend to speak in code, so I wanted to give you the code word up front. In 2019, Washington State mandated that many cities update their SMP to ensure that it was compliant with any changes that had taken place in recent years with the state laws. And while the council, this came to PPC and then it went on to the council, and the council's request when they were approving this was that we go not just comply with the state law changes, but that we go above and beyond for 3 particular components. We discussed whether we could do it at the time that we were updating these mandated changes, and we needed to do additional research or get consultant dollars. So we asked to incorporate these into Title 18, which is what we're doing now. SMP is kind of unusual for compared to many of our other regulations, that it's not just adopted by the city, but it's also adopted by DOE. And so when the council approves it, it has to go on to the state and be reviewed by them and approved by them. So our 2019 adoption or mandated update didn't actually get finalized until October 2020. last year, when we got some of the mapping changes that the state had asked for. So what we're bringing to you is that code that was finalized last October, the 3 proposed revisions that the council asked us to incorporate, and some minor edits that were identified by the new city attorney. And now I'm going to review the 3 elements that the council asked us to look at. First was dock lighting. The illustration on the right came from King County's outreach document. It's guidance, but we feel we were developing our code at the same time, but they actually line up quite nicely. So new docks, replacement of docks, or major repairs will have to come into compliance. Lighting cannot be more than 30 inches above the dock or grade. The lighting will have to be shielded or designed to only light the dock and not the water. It will need to have motion detection or some kind of automatic shutoff. It would use LEDs in a warm color, 2700K, as I mentioned, and no blue light. The second thing that we were asked to look at was eliminating the common line setback. In our current code, when a home is being remodeled or rebuilt or new, it's allowed to use the houses on either side of it to determine what the setback is. And if existing homes are closer than the required buffer and building setback, then that average line allows the homes to be built into the buffer or into the setback. So as I mentioned, we needed to do research. We hired a consultant to study the lots and houses along the lake so that we understood the existing situation. And we are proposing to eliminate the common line setback exception so that everything that's built either has the 35-foot buffer and the 15-foot building setback for a total of 50 feet from the shoreline. In terms of bulkhead removal, the current code uses an incentive to encourage people to remove the bulkhead by allowing a reduction in the required buffer. In recent years, we've only had 2 homes that took advantage of the incentive, and they were actually the same person on 2 different lots. So we didn't feel that the incentive was effective, and so the request from council and what we're proposing is to replace that with a requirement that you remove the bulkhead except where peer-reviewed study shows that it's meeting certain criteria that indicate that it is not feasible to remove the bulkhead. So the little illustration at the bottom is from the existing code. It's the one that had the big X through it in the draft. And it shows that yellow portion would be the example where you are removing the bulkhead and you're allowed to build into the setback and buffer, essentially having the 50 feet to 25. There were 2 consideration topics in the memo. One was about the threshold for removing bulkheads. The other was the threshold for dock lighting, which again, we can come back to if you want to discuss. Some of the top comments, just to let you know, again, we had an open house. We met with many commissioners and board members who wanted to talk with us. We also went to the Kokanee group and did a presentation on just the dock lighting. So we've had feedback from a number of different groups, and we've received a few direct comments. There was a conflict identified on page 59 where we missed some language that should be removed to ensure that we're taking out all the cross-references. There was some questions about how this will be consistent with critical areas standards and other chapters and titles. There was some concern around electrocution with flooding on the lake, and a suggestion that we use low voltage lighting rather than regular voltage lighting to reduce the chance of that. Several people suggested that the criteria for indicating that removal of a bulkhead was infeasible needed some clarifying language. And then there were some requests to make more wide-ranging changes to the SMP. And that's the end of my presentation.
And thank you very much, Lucy. So we'll go ahead and open this up for commissioner questions. And if you have a question, please put it in the chat window. Give it a moment here. First commissioner is Commissioner Milligan. You have the floor.
Thank you. Commissioner Nina Milligan here. Thanks, Lucy. I'm sorry, I'm going to make you repeat yourself. And maybe, I know how artful you are in rephrasing. But when we're talking about the bulkhead removal requirement and how that changes the buffer, I'd just like you to tell me that again in just a different way so I can understand it better. Thank you.
Sure. So right now there is an incentive to remove bulkheads, that the incentive is to allow you to reduce the buffer. And what we're saying is the incentive hasn't been effective in getting more people to remove their bulkheads. So we're going to eliminate the incentive, not allow you to reduce the buffer, and just require it in certain circumstances unless you demonstrate it's infeasible. Is that clear?
All right. Thank you very much, Commissioner Milligan. And Chair Davidson, you have the floor.
Okay, Lucy, I have a couple of questions for you. As I looked at your cover memo, you identified that one of the criteria for the council was to develop a more robust buffer enhancement and monitoring provisions. Can you describe for me how the changes that you've made in this address the need for enhancement and monitoring? I didn't see that anywhere in the changes here. It only just talks about how to get rid of one provision. So where's the enhancement and monitoring?
Well, that's a great point, Chair Davidson. That item was more broadly targeted at all critical areas. And so I think more of the enhancement shows up in the critical area code, which you're going to be reviewing soon. Really, I think that in terms of the Shoreline master program, eliminating the common line and the bulkhead removal incentive really ensures that we have the full dimensional buffer that the Shoreline master program has established for Lake Washington. So there's already enhancement and other provisions that are in the Shoreline Master Program. Please don't make me name them off the top of my head. I don't think I can do that. But the goal here was to, in as many cases as possible, have the full depth of the buffer present.
So if this goes back to council, they're not going to be asking if we are going to provide why this doesn't provide that enhancement? I'm just kind of curious along the way.
Well, do you think? I guess I'm not sure that the enhancement isn't already there. I think the main thing in the existing shoreline management program, I think the biggest concern was that we had all these means for reducing the buffer, and that was the biggest concern that we were hearing and asked to address for the Shoreline Master Program in particular.
Right, and I have another question for you. So in administering this, let's just say someone has a native growth buffer of 40 feet in one area, and in another area it's down to 15 feet. Is there any buffer averaging that goes along the way when you administer this, or is it, the 50 feet from the shoreline all the way down? How does that work?
So, great question. I don't know that there is averaging in the code. I did notice that as a public comment, and I think that would be something we'd need to do more research on. Not if you are building something new or redeveloping. I think we would want the full 50. I think the question is if you have an existing structure and you're adding on to it, for instance. And for instance, if part of the building is too close, should we be averaging and getting a deeper buffer on part of the lot? And that I don't think we've studied that yet. I think that's a follow-up task.
And that's one thing that it would be helpful to understand, to make sure that you're clear about, particularly on existing homes, if there's any averaging going to occur, or, if I give you a little more here, can I take more away there? That type of thing, which is really easy to do when it's not spelled out that it's allowed or not allowed. Sorry, I added a comment into my questions, and I'm sorry. And
Nancy,
yes.
I think Director Dollywall may want to phone a friend for me.
Thank you, Lucy. I'll try and answer your question. I think the setback along the lake is where this common line setback approach was done. And so the draft code takes away the averaging or figuring anything out in terms of reducing that. So the 50-foot would apply to the entire stretch. I think the other question relates to the buffer reduction for streams that was in the critical areas code, where you could reduce the buffer for 25%. That in the critical areas code is no longer an option. However, we've left the buffer averaging for streams in the draft code. And so there's some inconsistency in that we'll need to correct in the SMP, depending on what decisions are made on the critical areas code as it relates to buffer averaging for the streams. So as you all know, the shoreline applies to the lake and the two streams, Issaquah Creek and the North Fork. So there's a little bit of distinction, I think, for the lake versus the streams.
Okay, that covers my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair Davidson. And the next question is from Commissioner Lewis. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Commissioner Joy Lewis here. I am going to start with a relevant question because I know how you like those. Regarding dock lighting, I think that I have a concern still about spread. I appreciate that we're specifically calling out that light should not be directed down towards the water. But as most people are familiar, dock lighting can tend to not have any type of restriction. And I'm curious why there wasn't a choice to use some type of hood, some type of regulation to be able to really limit how the spread of a large dome light would end up impacting natural environment.
Well, we worked with our lighting consultant here as well. And I think they identified a couple of different aspects. One was, not having backlighting and or a board or some kind of bollard to keep the light on the dock. I wonder, I'm hypothesizing a little bit here, that because you're trying to light the dock surface, having some degree of spread reduces the number of fixtures that you have because you're trying to light the dock. So I think the question becomes, if you have can you see my hand out there?
I can.
You have the bollard and, you have some kind of hood that's throwing light this way. I don't know if there's some kind of evaluation that we can or should do to make sure it's not coming off this side of the dock edge. And that's a question I just don't know the answer to. I would need to check with our consultant.
I would just wonder, and it may just be my particular experience, but generally dock lighting is to the side of the dock. It's not down the center, right? So you're not getting a benefit from the spread, and instead being able to narrow it to the usable walkways rather than having that spread fall out seems like a natural way to be able to limit the exposure to the water.
Right. I think that's a great question that we'll need to have to do a little more research on.
Especially because I get to go like this when I ask my question.
Well, frankly, most dock surfaces are going to be some kind of expanded material that allow light through during the day. And so the reality is that as much as we're trying to contain it to the dock surface, the other component that's equally important is that it has the automatic shutoff and the motion detector, because there's going to be light that's going to go through that deck, even if you've perfectly contained it to the surface. And you want it on for the shortest period of time possible, not only just for the overall light, but because some of it will get through the deck surface.
I do appreciate that. My next question, I'm curious, does staff believe that all inconsistencies have been addressed? And this is kind of particular for where the S&P may fall short of implementing our updated environmental policies. I know that this is outside of the purview a little bit, but it is a good opportunity to be able to look at our Shoreline Master Program with fresh eyes. And I'm curious if staff feels that we've been able to incorporate the policies that we've implemented here into the S&P.
Would you help me out? And are you talking about like comp plan policies, or are you thinking of policies within the S&P?
Yeah, I mean, specifically in the last year, we've implemented new environmental policies that have been strongly backed by the community that have happened since the 2019 last overhaul of the Shoreline Master Program. I would have to imagine that you guys are sending this out to multiple departments and looking at, hey, how can we get more in line with our current policies? I'm curious if staff feels that they've done that and that this draft code reflects the most updated use of those policies.
So I think that in terms of other plans that were already in place, like comp plan, the Shoreline Master Plan's own policies, and probably the strategic plan, I think that we are probably okay. I think that I'm sure that we have not evaluated this against, for instance, the ICAP. Because we were really given such a narrow focus for the changes that we were asked to make.
Yes, which gets me to my next question. I probably have about 3 subset questions that I'm going to hold off on because I will give everyone a spoiler that I fall into the last bucket that Lucy presented of feedback that staff had gotten, of saying that I think that there's some more details that need to be looked at in a broader sense to the Shoreline Master Program. I do want to respect that we are focusing on the 3 revisions requested by council. So the next time that this comes to us, it would be nice if staff had gone to council, said that there was maybe some concerns about being able to have some more encompassing direction being provided. And if so, then I would have 3 other questions. But because they're not to our scope tonight, I'm just going to put a little caveat in there. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lewis. And Commissioner Voice, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fowl. Commissioner Jason Voice. So because Commissioner Lewis already did this, I don't get to do it. My question is real simple. So going to page 113 of the packet, basically dealing with the bulkhead, specifically C. So it talks about different alternatives. Having someone come out and assess, engineer, possibly replace or upgrade. And the question I have is, for a residential build, a single family lot, is that a hardship, or is that something the city plans on taking those costs and rolling it up into the basic building permit? Or is this something that they're going to have to finance on their own?
So this would definitely be the responsibility of the property owner. The page that you're referring to, 113, is where we need a little better introductory, where we got comments that we need a little better introductory information to be clear what the Roman numerals, the Romanettes is what one person called them, which I love that term. Introducing what those are a little more clearly. But yes, that would be the responsibility of the property owner. There are these criteria that if there are impacts that make the project infeasible. I do think that one of the things about the threshold, though, for the bulkhead program is there probably has to be some level of proportionality between the cost of the bulkhead removal and the cost of the project. And I imagine that's one thing that we'll continue to talk to our legal counsel on to make sure that what we're doing is, in line.
So that would be a separate expense, Lucy. That wouldn't be something as far as the initial inspection, as far as staking lot, setting things back, as far as setbacks. That couldn't be something included because, again, they're having to engineer or possibly assess. Again, it kind of sounds like a specialist would have to come and do that, not necessarily a city planner.
Oh, yeah. No, this assessment would be a technical expert, and we would also require a peer review, and that would not be staff either. That would require a level of expertise that, yes, the applicant would be asked to pay for. So that is, you're right, an additional cost.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Commissioner Boyce. And Commissioner McWilliams, you have the floor.
Oh, I withdrew my question. Thank you, though. I got my answer I was looking for.
Excellent. Thank you. So moving forward here, Commissioner Finch, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Fall. Jamie Finch speaking. I had a question on the section related to native plantings in the buffer. I didn't notice any specific timelines for monitoring. Is that mandated somewhere else, or can you help me understand what the standard for monitoring around plantings in a buffer would be?
I'm going to ask if Minnie happens to know that. I will try and check it while we're sitting here because it's not a section that we were changing. I don't know it off the top of my head.
So, are you asking about the length of the time for the monitoring?
Yeah, because at least as I read it, it said, I think it was 80-20, if I'm remembering correctly, but it didn't have any other specifications around it. And I just don't know if that lives somewhere else and it's defined, or if there is no timeline for how long that would be monitored.
Well, I'm seeing one set, let's see, shoreline vegetation preservation requires a 5 years of maintenance and monitoring, at least in one place.
Okay, so maybe I just missed it.
It's on page 57 of the actual document, not the packet page.
Okay. One other question I had related to timelines was around pruning I think it was pruning in the buffer, which I think it says that you can prune 25% of the branches and it doesn't set a timeline. So I'm just not sure, is that I can prune 25% today, I come out tomorrow, I prune more 25%, in 4 days I have no tree left? Is there any standards around that? Because it just seemed like it was ripe for someone taking advantage.
Yeah, good point. We will look at that. Of course, we don't want people will look at code creatively to see what you can do to do that. But the idea with the 25% is because the trees will die if you butcher them more than 25%, and so that's where that provision comes from. But from a science perspective, how long do you need to how often you need to prune, sort of thing. So we'll look at that.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you very much, Commissioner Finch. And Commissioner Milligan, you have the floor.
Hello, Nina Milligan again. Lucy, wanted to ask, and I'm going by packet numbers. What's the page of the document? 22 of the document, 56 of 155 in the packet. I wanted to ask, do we have salt water? Because there's in the revision there, it talks about salt water. That's my first question.
I don't think we do have any salt water.
Okay. I'll just point that out for kicks. And then I want to look at page 27 of the document, 61 of the packet, water quality definition, and it looks to me like it's a copy and paste error. So that's a question. Is that a copy and paste error?
So I wasn't the lead author, but I would say that seems like maybe it was.
Yeah, it came from somewhere else. So I'll give you that little heads up for your editor.
Thank you.
We'll find it probably. And then and we're only talking about those 3 topics from the council and the changes that we've made to the SMP, but I wish we were talking about all the shoulds that I started really noticing racking up as I read that document. You should do this, and you should do that, and the inability to enforce a should and the confusion that it causes the community. So I won't ask that question. I'll save it for later, but don't forget it. Okay, Lucy?
Right. The one thing I will say that's a tricky thing about SMP, and because I haven't looked at locations of shoulds, this may not be accurate, but the SMP is a combination both of the policy documents or the policies and the standards or regulations. So I think the question would be, are the shoulds in the regulations or the shoulds in the policies? And that I don't know off the top of my head.
All right. Thank you very much, Commissioner Milligan. I am not seeing any additional questions. So we're going to go ahead and open it up for public comment. Is there any members of the public that would like to make a comment?
Yes, I apologize. Yes, Connie Marsh would like to comment. Connie, you are now a panelist. You can turn your camera on.
I did. There you go. Thank you. So Connie Marsh again on Squawk Mountain. So I actually called Department of Ecology on this SMP because I was reading the new draft code, and the new draft code called out wetlands. And so I said, what? Wetlands? It never says wetlands in our SMPs, even though our new code says wetlands. And she says, yes, it is not just your streams, it is the associated wetlands and the floodways. And the SMP rules anything with 300 feet from the outer edge of those areas. And she said, we don't really care if your SMP talks about it. It is state law, so you have to do it anyway. Our SMP is very unclear in this. So that is a state law that somehow has sort of slithered through. You all updated the maps in, what is it, the 2019 updates, right? But I was looking at the maps, and I don't see the wetlands and floodways mapped out. The maps, one of the maps doesn't show anything even remotely close. The other one maybe nudges at it a little bit, but the maps don't show the actual critical area and then the associated other water bodies. And I think, for clarity, I think they actually have to do that in order to be able to use them. And she just sort of laughed at me because she says, well, you have to. So then the other thing is, the state law has made us put habitat and habitat protections not in all of our codes and plans, right? This is a new segment. It can't just be you're protecting a stream. You have to be protecting the habitat in and around the stream. So when you say that you're updating for legal purposes, well, that is a clear and identified legal purpose that is missing in the SMP. So I'm curious as to how we're updating the SMP and not bringing it up to state law in that situation. So this brought me to well, what are we really trying to do with the Shoreline Master Program? And so I came up with my own idea, which is these are considered to be the shorelines of statewide significance. They're supposed to be our most significant water bodies, but we must allow access to the public for these shorelines. And that's one of the differences. It's also one of the very few ways that we can control WSDOT. It is basically our only little edge to make WSDOT do good things. That's an aside. So in my brain, because these are extra special, their buffers should be showing via best available science how we are protecting the habitat areas to the largest extent possible in these areas using best available science. So real forward, and we have this code that I have just spent a lot of time reading our new code, and it has now adding in this thing that is a fish and wildlife conservation habitat areas. And if you look at the maps of those entirely echo our shoreline master plan maps, and they also include wetlands and the flood. I don't know if they do floodplains or floodways, but they also do the small ones. So it's an overlay. My concept is that if we use best available science in our code, then we might be able to easily update the regulations in the Shoreline Master Program by referencing the new code. And best available science, in theory, though I don't know if this is actually true, will get us the buffers and habitat protections that we desire for our wetlands, floodways, etc. Now, the policies need to stay in the Shoreline Master Program, and those are all those shoulds, and there's a lot of shoulds. And then there's going to be a few regulations that are very specific to the Shoreline Master Program because they live entirely there. But I think the idea that you could actually have a functional Shoreline Master Program, use the fish and wildlife conservation habitat areas and the code, they right now, I do not see how they are going to mesh in any way where someone couldn't just point and say, well, I want to choose that rule. And you're never going to figure out that they can't use that rule. They're supposed to use the other rule because they are not elegantly intertwined. So I've tried to solve the problem of having to redo the entire SMP by instead just using references to a potential new code. So my suggestion is that this come back with the changes that will elegantly connect it with the new critical area codes, and then see what it looks like then. Because I agree with these people that say the SMP will not function how it currently exists. I don't care what the council said. They only said that they could only do 3 things because staff came at them and said, we don't have time to do more than 3 things. And so we didn't. And that was not a happy place. I lived that. So I remember. We can do it. I know we can. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no one else who has signed up to speak.
All right, thank you, Kristen. So we're going to go ahead and officially close out public comment at 8:04. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Chair Davidson to go ahead and conduct the commission comments for the Environmental Board, and PPC can go ahead and turn off their cameras.
Thank you, Ron. We appreciate that. And with that, I'm open to any comments from the Environmental Board on the SMP. Well, I'll start this off. I have several comments associated with this, and sometimes I go first, sometimes I don't. But I am troubled by the SMP and its lack of connection to the Critical Areas Ordinance. First of all, the council asked for a robust buffer enhancement, And I don't think it referenced just critical areas, but it also should be looking at, the areas along our creek, particularly Issaquah Creek and East Fork of Issaquah Creek, in addition to the shoreline, the lake shoreline. And I don't think the SMP has addressed those areas. The second point I'd like to make is that there are several inconsistencies in terms of buffers between the SMP and the Title 18 Critical Areas Draft Part A. I'm also concerned that it will also, I haven't seen the stormwater code, but that's coming to us next month. And I think that too, we will see inconsistencies with the requirements in that. Thirdly, there's several opportunities in the Stormwater Master Program that provides opportunities for variances. They can be done with the director's approval. I also see that you can get 3 different permits. I don't see, not being familiar with all of these processes since we don't do those often. Need to figure out how to get the public involved to make sure that there are rules when variances, it's not just how you feel about a piece of property on a certain day, and that we're treating people in the public consistently. And in some cases, that hasn't necessarily happened in the city all the time. And I think that's something we should look at. I think Connie's point to including the wetlands, which are part of the buffers around the creeks, is very important, and it's not included in this. Sorry, I had several comments written up, as you can probably tell. I'm concerned about the shalls, shoulds, mays, and where feasibles that are included in the document and sprinkled throughout. And I would encourage us to be more thoughtful about what is a shall and get rid of the where feasibles. And then my last few comments, there are many references to Title 18 critical areas that are not going to be accurate anymore. If you go look at the critical areas piece that is coming to us next month, all those references are no longer accurate. And then my last point to make to this is there are words used in here that are not defined. And I found 2 that really troubled me trying to figure out what they meant, because I haven't really looked at this before. The first one is the average grade level on the shoreline. I don't know what that means. It's not defined anywhere in the document, and it's therefore subject to interpretation. The second one is upland lot area. Wow, I'm not sure what that one means either, but I think there are places where there are opportunities for people to take advantage of this, and that too troubles me. So in my personal opinion, to pass on to PPC is that we really need to move forward and do a more rigorous update of the Shoreline Master Program, because particularly the differences between this and the critical areas piece of Title 18 are very different. And we need to make sure that we have consistency, because when we don't have it, that's when developers or land developers take advantage of it. With that, that concludes my comments on it so far. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jamie.
Thank you, Nancy. Jamie Finch speaking. I think first, I would just echo what Nancy and a few others have said around making sure that this plan is consistent with the critical areas portion. I think one of the areas, I appreciate some of the changes that were made that seem to be more specific to Lake Sammamish, the common line setback, the removal of the bulkhead incentive. I think those are good changes. I do wonder, a lot of the changes seem to be very specific to only Lake Sammamish, and I don't know, that might not be the case. I just wonder, are we leaving out changes that should be made for Issaquah Creek and the East Fork? Because it seems like we don't have, and I'm not totally clear on the problems that we feel we have there, but it doesn't seem like we have changes specific to those waterways, which I think probably is more surface area than the Lake Sammamish shoreline combined. So, and arguably more important. So I think that would be my one piece of feedback is, have we gone in and really made sure that we have addressed problems on Issaquah Creek and the East Fork? Because it feels like the changes, the most substantive changes are mostly very specific to Lake Sammamish. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Does anybody else from the Environmental Board have comments on the SMP? Anybody else? Going once? Going twice? All right, I think that concludes our comments for the PPC.
All right, thank you very much, Chair Davison. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to Kristen. Kristen, do we have any additional reports or City Council updates or other business announcements?
I do, actually. I have two.
Kristen, can I answer a couple of comments that came through? And Chair Fall, if you may allow, just a little bit of clarification on the critical area piece and the interplay with the Shoreline Master Program.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So, really good comments and excellent feedback. So appreciate everyone's thoughtful readings and bringing all these issues forward. I wanted to address quickly in terms of how the Shoreline Master Program that is formally approved by Department of Ecology. I wasn't here in 2019, but at the time, there were some changes made to the critical areas code that is separate from here. So if you look on your page, I believe it's 44 of the packet, it'll reference an ordinance number for critical areas that's specifically adopted there. And then it has these exemptions that are in critical area don't really apply in the shoreline management area. So you may need a shoreline permit, even though it may be exempt under the critical areas. So the role of Department of Ecology and their concern usually with having separate critical areas code or ordinances, they want to be very clear about what's adopted with the SMP, that the jurisdictions don't go back and, if they're making changes to the critical areas code, it's within the legislative authority of the jurisdictions. But the SMP is formally adopted and approved by Ecology before we can implement it. So therefore, we will be having those conversations with Department of Ecology of as you all work on the critical areas chapter of how that will get folded into this. Otherwise, you're correct. We would have a different critical areas ordinance under the shoreline. So we need to work on the critical areas piece and then come back and close the loop with the shoreline. So I just wanted to kind of, close the loop on that. Yes, that will happen as we work through the critical area piece and work with Department of Ecology. So back over to you, Kristen.
Thank you. And actually, of something, I know that a lot of you came in as attendees tonight, and Nancy had asked me to maybe explain. Apparently, I do it differently than Stacy does it, the invitations. So when I send them out through WebEx, the invitations come to you as panelists. So I set up a panelist list, and you are included as panelists, and I send it out. So it should be that you accept the meeting. And once you do that, you should be able to hop right into the panelist list and not be an attendee. I shouldn't have to bring you in. However, I know a lot of you have Gmail too, and that works differently than Outlook. So if there is a PPC member who could explain how they do it in Gmail, if anybody would like to raise their hand and volunteer, that would be really helpful. Nina.
Of all people who
I know, but you just went through this. You had some difficulties.
Yeah, and I just accepted your invitation for March 9th. So I just saw it. So it comes to me in my calendar as showing as a hatched, untended to invitation. And within the invitation, you have the accept or decline drop down menus. And that just worked for me. I think Kristen should have gotten in. I accept for the 9th, but I didn't get an email. It was just a draft piece in the calendar. I don't think I got an email about it. It just showed up in my calendar. I had to go to my calendar and see it and say accept.
Okay.
That's Gmail.
So it was on your calendar, and you just came in and.
Yeah, and let me clarify. It's Gmail for the receiving email, but I'm using Outlook, not Google Calendar. That would be yet again different. That's the best I can do, you guys. Got far.
I just don't want environmental board members to feel like I'm not letting you in as panelists. I do invite you as panelists. I can't always explain the other end of it though, and why it doesn't always. So I thought I'd try and give that a shot. Okay. Moving on. On Tuesday night, there was a regular council meeting. Council approved the allocation of $3.1 million in ARCH general funds for 4 different projects, but one of those included 5 LEO affordable units in the transit-oriented development project that is being worked on right now. Council also voted to go ahead and move all 3 items that were on the docket forward in 2022. So you all will be seeing those at the end of this year. They recognized your work and thanked you for what you had done and for the considerations that you had made. They just felt like the applications had been submitted, they were complete. So we're just going to go ahead and move forward with those this year. I think Minnie had her hand raised.
Yeah, you covered it right, Kristen. So council really wanted to appreciate the work Planning and Policy Commission does for this year. Those 3 rezone requests that came in without having any criteria in the code to say yes or no for those and other reasons. They ended up adding it to the docket, but they wanted to send special appreciation and thanks for all the work that Planning and Policy Commission does on all the different items that come before you. So,
yeah. And lastly, I wanted to remind you, and it's come up a couple of times tonight, that your next meeting is actually on March 9th, and you will be attending at this regular environmental board meeting. So you've received invitations for that. And then we'll be together again the following night, all of us, for March 10th for another public hearing on natural environment. So eat lots of good veggies and stuff and get your energy on. Okay. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. And with that, we will go ahead and conclude our meeting tonight at 8:17.